Hamblin, feast on the word, it brings me alive. Cuts through shadows, ends my strife. Taste and see that.
Hey y'all, welcome back to Feasting on the Word. I am DG Hamblin, and yes, I am back. I had to take a little bit of time off because one of my classes this term was a real headache, and I had to put a lot of time and effort and energy into that class so that I could get an A, and I did. So now we're back. And before we jump back into the secret combinations, I had a little snack, another snack for you today, like I did in my last video. Something that I found here that I thought was really cool. One of those things that you find when you keep stuff in the back of your mind to kind of, I don't want to put it, that's not the best way. Anyway, as you're studying, kind of looking for things that remind you of other things. You know, again, that kind of stuff that's in the back of your mind and your subconscious that's just there, that when you see something that triggers that memory, it lets you make connections. Maybe I'm not making much sense. When the book is out, it will explain it much better. Anyway, so we're going to be in First Nephi chapter 8, and then we're going to go to Psalm 23, because when I was reading in Psalm 23 the other week, man, I just had this, one of those connections got made. And I realized, okay, Lehi's dream basically is Psalm 23. So let's just look at some stuff in Lehi's dream real quick. We're not going to read this whole chapter or even the whole thing about the dream. We're just going to touch on some of the highlights to keep this shorter. In verse like 6 and 7, maybe verse 5, you know, this man dressed in a white robe appears to Lehi, and he kind of escorts him through this vision that he has. And he follows, Lehi follows this guy, and he finds himself in this dark and dreary waste. And that itself is an indication, if you think back to the temple, if you have been endowed in the temple, that ought to be something that might grab your attention there. We do know that this is we do see this typically as a kind of a temple scene. Also, Psalms 23, so it shouldn't surprise us that we find some correlation here between the two. So he travels for a space of many hours. He prays, and then we get into, after he prays unto the Lord, in verse 9, he sees a large and spacious field. He also sees a tree in verse 10 whose fruit was desirable to make one happy. In verse 11 and 12, he partakes of the fruit, and as he partakes of it, it says he says that it filled my soul with exceedingly great joy. So he wants his family to partake. Then he, as he looks around, he sees a river of water that goes by this tree, and we read a little later that it goes, I guess in the next verse even, it goes by the head. He sees the head of the river a little ways off. He sees his family. He calls to them. And then in verse 19 is the next point we want to think of with this vision of the tree of life of Lehi's. In verse 19, he says, I also beheld a rod of iron, and it extended along the bank of the river that led to the tree. And then in verse 20, he says, I beheld a straight and narrow path, which came along by the rod of iron. Even so, there's this straight and narrow path. There's this rod of iron. It leads to the tree, goes by the head of the fountain. All these people are coming forward. And it says in verse 23, another point we want to key in on here is that there is a mist of darkness, yea, even an exceedingly great mist of darkness. And so people who are in this path, they become lost. They get lost. They wander off. And then there are some others that press forward. They grab this rod of iron, they cling to it, and they make their way to the tree. And then we read that they partake of the fruit. Some of them, that make it to the tree, that partake of the fruit. And then there's this great and spacious building. Okay, so they're partaking of the fruit. Then there's this great and spacious building. And right now I'm going to take a quick time out because I want to point out, if you have not read this book, I suggest reading it because it will change the way that you look at the Book of Mormon, the way you read it. D. John Butler, Dave Butler, there are two Dave Butlers. He's the one that you see frequently. If you watch the Stick of Joseph podcast, he is often on there. And I got to meet him a year ago, maybe not, a year ago or so. And we had a conversation because there were things that I had found in the Book of Mormon. And we talked about his book, and the stuff that I had found complemented what he had found, but he explains it so much better than I ever could. You're going to find layer upon layer upon layer. He's not paying me to do this. This is just how much I love this book. Layer upon layer of meaning in the Book of Mormon that many of us just miss because we don't have the eyes to see it. Okay, back to what we were talking about. Okay. People in the great and spacious building, and he talks about that there. They're pointing and they're laughing, right? They're making fun of, they're mocking and pointing their fingers towards those who are partaking of the fruit. And so some of those then they fall away. They become ashamed. Okay. So I'm just going to kind of sum up the points we have in 1 Nephi 8. We have a large and spacious field. We have a tree with fruit, this meal that you partake of when you get to the tree of life. It makes you happy, and then also it brings you great joy. But you are partaking the fruit of this tree, and then there are these other people who can see you partaking of it and eating of it. That's going to be important. There's a river of water. There's a rod of iron, the straight and narrow path, and these mists of darkness. Now, let's read Psalm 23, and let's look at all the correlations there are here between these two passages. Of course, Psalm 23 is much shorter. It's only 6 verses long, so it's kind of like a Reader's Digest condensed version of kind of the same thing. Okay, he starts off, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures, like a large and spacious field, perhaps, as it were a world. He leadeth me beside the still waters. There's a river of water. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. So the paths of righteousness, a straight and narrow path of righteousness. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, this dark, scary place that he has to go through, I will fear no evil. Why? Why? Because for thou art with me. Who's with me? Well, the Lord is with him. Thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Okay, so the Lord is with him. The rod of iron in the Book of Mormon is symbolic of what? The Word of God. Who is the Word of God? Jesus Christ, who is accompanying David here in Psalm 23. The Lord, who is the Lord? Yahweh, Jehovah, who became Jesus Christ, the same person, with a rod and a staff. And by the way, where a rod is a symbol of power, it's like a scepter, when you think of royalty and kingship. But the rod was also the primary offensive weapon of the shepherd, which he would use to defend his flock against animals, um, vicious beasts, lions, and bears, but also against robbers or people who might want to take his flock and scatter it. I think about Ammon when he first is serving the king and he goes out with the shepherds to with the flocks, and the bad guys come and they have these clubs and he has a sword, he's cutting their arms off. Well, the clubs they had would have been the shepherd's rod. Anyway, okay, so they ride on thy staff, we have the rod, and we also have, of course, the Lord there. So we have the rod represented kind of in two ways. Okay, now, verse 5, thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. I didn't write down the Hebrew phrase. I forgot to. It doesn't matter. The Hebrew phrase there, which is translated here, in the presence of mine enemies, also has a sense of separateness. So the enemies can see, but they can't join in because they are separated, they're apart. It could also be translated away from mine enemies. So there is a meal here, a table which is prepared. What's prepared on the table? Well, it would be a feast, a meal, probably the Shalom feast or the bread and wine feast, the covenant feast, which seals the covenant making in the Old Testament, and which we use to renew our covenants that we make every week in sacrament meeting. So there is a feast here. There is the meal, just like we have the fruit from the tree. There's the meal. There are the people who are the enemies who can see. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. So he's blessed. And we think about the language that Lehi uses when he partakes of the fruit of the tree of life, this exceeding great joy. Is that not a sense of your cup running over, being blessed so abundantly that you can't contain it all? That's the sense that I get. So I think there is correlation there. And then surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. So then there is this dwelling in the house of the Lord, the making it to the celestial kingdom, the place, where we're all trying to get on the straight and narrow path as we go through life and go through the temptations and dark times which we make through if we are clinging to the rod of iron, or if we're make sure that we are accompanied by Jesus Christ as we go through these things. It was one of those moments that when I read that, and I'm confident that the Spirit was showing it to me as well, because when I was reading and all of a sudden I made that connection, man, the Spirit that I felt in that moment was just almost overwhelming. It's really cool. Anyway, I wanted to share that with y'all. I hope to see you again real soon. Hope you have a blessed day. Please know that I love you, and go and read and study and find something really cool and share it with somebody else so they can be blessed as well. And I'll see y'all next time.